there, and there. Okay, great. So, and there's Mark. All right, well, we'll get started though. As Mark is joining here, I'll give a shout out for the folks tuning in at home to what we're doing here. This is a business podcast mastermind. It started with a few talented friends in the business and podcasting space and expanded it to create a weekly event where a wider audience can join. And we have like basically a few co-hosts here. So I'll tell you a little bit about each of us and then we'll get rolling and introduce our guest. So typically we have Rob here, Rob Greenlee, VP of Content and Partnerships at Libsyn, former chair of the Podcast Academy, co-host of the New Media Show, and longtime evangelist of the podcasting industry. Henry here tuning in from Colorado today, a serial entrepreneur, small business coach, and host of the top-rated How of Business podcast, dedicated to helping others start, run, and grow their small business. And I'm Ethan Janney, do some business and executive coaching, as well as have two podcasts now, added one since we last saw you, Heather. I've got the Run With It podcast and the Edge of NFT podcast. So I'll introduce Heather Osgood, who is our guest, our gracious guest for the day. She has owned, operated, and sold several highly successful businesses. With a background in radio advertising and a love for podcasting, she founded True Native Media in January of 2016 with the hopes of helping everyone find a bigger piece of that advertising pie. And so hopes and fulfilling those hopes, I think, as well. You've definitely grown a significant business. A lot of people turn to you for expertise on advertising. So what we thought we'd do today is, do some check-in with you since last time, but officially welcome. I'll let you say your piece before I dive into buffeting you with questions.
Yeah, well, thank you guys so much for having me on. It's great to be here, and I always enjoy talking about podcast advertising, and I'm excited to hear what you guys have going on in your podcast as well.
I think literally since the last time we talked, there might be a million new podcasts.
Oh, I think you could be right, actually, because I know at the beginning of like the pandemic, people just started creating podcasts, and it's like all of a sudden it's just gaining all of the steam. And when did we cross the $1 million threshold or the million mark? I think it was like at the end of 2020. And now I know we're over 2 million, which is just crazy, the quantity of shows out there. But you also, like, if you look at any of the stats, like how many of the people out there that have a podcast actually are actively producing shows, it's much, much smaller. So I try to kind of keep that in perspective too.
Yeah. But it's good to have the interest there. So I'm curious, like, are you seeing a lot of these new podcasters and people that come to you for assistance, or, because of the nature of what you do, trying to work with people who are, like have something significant that they're putting together, that you're dealing with people who've been in it for, a longer period of time, at least a year or so? Like, what do you see in terms of the people that come to want to work with you?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I would say increasingly we get, newer podcasters that are coming to us. And it's fascinating to take a look at the type of content that grows really well and the kind of content that doesn't. I think one that always blows my mind the most was there was a gal I spoke with, and she went on Reddit and found interesting, like, kind of articles where people just told like really just kind of funny stories about things that were happening in their lives and relationships. And so she started this podcast and YouTube channel where she just read these stories, and she was good at it. She did a good job reading them, but she didn't really do much. And her show had gotten so many downloads, and I was shocked, like, at how quickly it had grown. The other segment that really seems like it grows quite quickly is true crime. So what I've found with true crime shows is a lot of the newer true crime shows, they will start, with one specific, very, highly spoken about or publicized case. And so I think it really, like, it adds to the steam really quickly for them. So, I definitely think there are some strategies when you're creating a new show. along the content lines that help grow an audience quickly. For us, though, we still do really want to look at a show. We used to say the show had to be publishing for at least a year before we would start selling ads on the show. And we've kind of, we bend the rules from time to time, depending on how good the show is or how many, downloads it's getting. But the problem is that with new shows, there's just not that track record, right? We can't say like, oh, we know that this person is dedicated to their show and they've been publishing consistently. So we still really want to see that there is that consistent quality, content and like steady audience growth, because you could have a flash in the pan today. And especially with more and more shows doing dynamic ad insertion, you might have a sudden decline in your listenership too. And how could that impact things? So we're really having to consider the types of shows that we're taking on. But to answer your question, yeah, we definitely are seeing a lot of newer shows that are interested in representation, as well as older shows, of course, too. But the increase of interest from newer shows is definitely up.
Right. People that can grow really quickly. Yeah, it's interesting. Now, I feel like last time we talked, there was almost a threshold that you gave in terms of amount of downloads per episode or per month. I want to say it was somewhere in the at least 5 to 10. Is that still the case? And is that, I forget whether that was per episode or per month, or, what kind of thresholds are you seeing in terms of being able to do some advertising for revenue?
Yeah, so at True Native Media, we really are trying to grow our organization. So when I founded the company, I wanted to try and work with as many smaller shows as possible because I felt that they really lacked representation. And while it's still important for us to try and work with those that are, maybe lacking representation, at our organization, we're really looking to try and partner with larger and larger shows, because as the industry grows and we grow, we know that we have a lot to offer. And so we're looking to partner with large shows. In terms of our personal thresholds, we're now at 10,000 downloads per episode in a 30-day period. If a show is doing dynamic ad insertion, then we'll look at their entire catalog, and we'd like them to be somewhere between 20 and 30,000 downloads per month. And so that's True Native Media. And of course, those are kind of the lower end, and we're looking to represent even larger. But I would say that since we last talked, there definitely are more and more different companies that are coming to the table, offering representation. And so I think that there certainly are lots of opportunities for shows and smaller shows to be represented or to get ads placed on their shows. And that, I would say, you could start at even 1,000 downloads per month and kind of go up from there.
And maybe slightly off topic from what your expertise is, but like, how would you recommend people are going about doing that? Is it just to get the practice in, like, oh, let me practice having a sponsor, or do you see that if it's the right type of podcast, maybe they can get some significant revenue, with just having a handful of listeners? I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, both are correct. So what I find is that if your show is going to be more broad, that you would really benefit, especially if your show is smaller, from starting with affiliate opportunities. So I know there, like Buzzsprout in particular, I know offers affiliate opportunities. There are also just lots of different affiliate programs you could go and sign up on. So if you are a podcaster and you're smaller, but you want to grow into advertising, or that's a big part of where you would like to, receive revenue, I encourage podcasters to start with those affiliate ads, because it does a couple things. Number one, it allows the host to get practice, because if you're doing those host read, endorsement type ads, that does take practice to get good at. Number two, you can see the actual conversions that are happening. So because it's an affiliate relationship, you'll know if you're getting conversions, whereas with paid ads, most paying advertisers aren't going to tell you how many conversions they actually received. So it gives you a lot of insights, and you can say like, oh my gosh, look at my audience, they're super responsive. or my audience isn't responsive. And then you can do a bit of testing, right? Maybe they don't respond super well to Audible, but they do respond really well to BetterHelp, or, so you could decide which types of advertisers you want. And then you could create a case that these types of advertisers respond really well to my audience. It gives you a proven track record that you could then take to advertisers and say, hey, on average, we could deliver this type of a conversion for this type of an advertiser. So I think that that's a really good way to go. Now, obviously, Ethan, with a show like yours with like NFTs, that's very specific. And, there's a lot of talk and, a lot of commotion around NFTs right now. And so if you went to a specific company that is looking to reach that specific audience, you're going to have the ability to charge them much more. And the way I always look at it is if you are, if you've got like, I know this year I talked to a veterinarian podcast, right, where they specifically were targeting veterinarians. If I've got software that's created, for veterinarians, how many conversions do I need to get from your podcast to make it make sense? So if you've got a really specific, niche topic, you certainly can charge quite a bit more. And, if you have 1,000 downloads, that's probably plenty, right? Because even if you have 6 to 1,000 different listeners, if they're qualified, they can be worth a lot. So I know that that's not a super black and white answer, but I really do think that that gives podcasters the ability to look at their show, see where they're at and the type of content they're creating, the type of audience that they have, and then make a decision as to where they should go.
Cool. Thank you for that. Yeah, you're right. There's a lot of commotion in that particular space. It's been a very interesting case study in podcasting. So I want to ask you because you just mentioned it. Actually, you know what? I'm going to ask you this because I thought of it. So people usually ask you this towards the end of an interview, but I want to ask it a little bit earlier.
Sure.
Is there a question that you don't get asked that you wish people would ask you about this topic of advertising, or it's like something that you're always thinking about, but nobody's ever asking about?
That's a really good question. I always really love, and maybe it's good that Rob is not on this call today, but I love to talk about hosting providers, or maybe it's too bad that he isn't. I don't think that podcasters pay enough attention to their hosting provider, because your hosting provider can have a really big impact on your ability to deliver ads. And there's a lot of nuances that go into looking at your hosting provider, kind of getting back to the, where we started the conversation with the quantity of podcasters out there. When you look at like the breakdown of where shows are, a lot, like I'm not sure if it's half, but a lot of those new podcasters are coming in on, I think like Anchor is number 1 and then Buzzsprout is number 2. They're people who aren't paying for their hosting. And so it's really interesting because it's like, well, how invested are they actually in creating a business out of this? Is it a hobby? So I really believe that you have got to take a look at your show and figure out like, why are you creating this show and where do you want to take it? And then look at the hosting provider, because somebody like Anchor is great because it's free. So you can get out there and you can get on Anchor quick and cheap. And then also Anchor will place ads on your show, which could be good, but most of the ads that Anchor places are ads for Anchor. So it's kind of ironic. Then you've got Buzzsprout, which I know also has free service, but Buzzsprout definitely.
It's like a pyramid scheme where you don't even get to be part of the pyramid, really. You don't even get to actually sell the thing to the next person. They're doing it for you.
Well, and the other thing that frustrates me about Anchor is that Anchor dynamically inserts...
Nothing against Anchor, sorry.
No, I totally agree.
I don't know much about it, to be honest. But
the thing that is hard for me about Anchor is that they use dynamic insertion to put ads in your show, but then they don't allow you, the host, to use that technology, which I always feel like just seems like it's not fair. Whereas like Spreaker, for instance, is a podcast host that will allow you, they will insert ads, pre-recorded ads into your show. You can do host read ads and you can do your own dynamically inserted ads. So really it's kind of looking at how are you wanting to get paid and the services that this hosting provider offers you. And if you have if you have the hosting provider that is going to grow with you, or, you're going to outgrow Anchor at some point, right? So why not pay the $10 a month to get on a hosting provider that's more like sophisticated? So anyways, that's the question I feel like people don't ask enough, and one that I think is really important, especially as it pertains to advertising. And I think a lot of times people don't really even think about the fact that your hosting provider would have such a big impact on your ads.
Right. And to make it maybe oversimplified, I don't know.
Sure.
What are there? You mentioned Spreaker, Libsyn, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Rob is part of. Are there specific hosts that you often recommend, or think people might want to lean towards? Especially if they're serious about podcasting and advertising and that side of it.
Yeah, so I am a huge proponent of dynamic ad insertion. So I think that if you really do want to make, revenue that through ads, that you should be on a platform that can allow you to grow to dynamic insertion. So a platform like Libsyn, for instance, you can start out on a basic Libsyn plan, and then you could eventually grow to Libsyn Pro that allows for you to do dynamic insertion without having to switch hosting providers. Spreaker does the same thing. Buzzsprout does the same thing, but Buzzsprout only allows you to insert one ad at each of the ad locations, which really limits your ability to maximize revenue. So in terms, I guess, to answer your questions, the ones I would look at would be Libsyn. I think Spreaker is a good option. Simplecast can be a good option for folks starting out. If you're at more of an enterprise level and you're really, looking to grow a very large audience, Megaphone and Art19 and Omni Studios, those are all really very reputable hosting companies that also have really good dynamic insertion platforms. So that's what I would look at.
Cool. A follow-up to that question, which I appreciate sort of the interesting answer there. Anything else where you feel like people, I find I've been in many domains, right? I've been in science, I've been in podcasting, I've been in business. And in all of those cases, you have to make decisions about spending money versus like budgeting, right? And so are there any other places where you see that people really should be spending more, but they just don't realize it. They pay the price by waiting a couple of years to really realize, oh, I should have bought this or invested in this or spent because it was going to pay off. I just didn't, realize it. Any other places like that?
I
Especially as it
really
applies to advertising, probably, right?
Yeah, I mean, this doesn't necessarily apply to advertising directly, but I really think production. I was listening to this weekend, we're going through some restructuring at our company. And so I was like, okay, I'm getting ready for my day. So I just go to Spotify and I put like, company reorganization, or I think I put in like restructuring my company or something like that, right? So I just get a list. And that's what I love Spotify for, because it gives you a nice list of different shows. So I listened to several new shows that I had not listened to before, which was kind of fun. And the production quality on 3/4 of them were just really poor. Where the intro, for instance, you could tell that like the host had recorded it in one mic, maybe in one room. And then they go to the actual interview and the host sounds totally different. I know it's so hard when you're interviewing guests because not everybody has a good mic, and that's a really hard thing to solve for. But if your show feels amateurish, then those are the types of advertisers that you are going to attract or not attract, right? If we just, there was a big kind of upfront is what they call it, but the IAB put together a panel that they do once a year of all of kind of the new shows that advertisers should pay attention to. And this last week, the upfront took place. And one of the topics that was discussed was that 45% of the spending happening in podcast advertising in 2020 was brand advertising, which is up significantly because used to be very heavily direct response. And so seeing that we have such a big group moving into branding, that means that much larger organizations are looking at the space and saying like, hey, I think there's something there, which is great. It's what we need the industry, where we need the industry to be. But, when you're talking about large brands, and a lot of the spending, of course, is happening, at a high level, but a brand wants to partner with a show that they feel is going to be a good representation of their company. And if the production of your show isn't, if it's not worth your time and energy to make a good show, then why would you think that it would be worth a brand's time, energy, and money to invest in your show? So really, I think just making sure that you can set your podcast up as best as possible, and that you really are, you don't necessarily have to pay somebody to produce your show. There are lots of great tools out there that you can use, but at the end of it, do you have sound issues? Do you have like close editing cuts where it's like, wait, like I could just tell they spliced the heck out of that, right? Like all of those things make your show feel like amateurish. And if you can invest in the quality of your show, it's going to attract a different kind of advertiser.
Yeah, that's a good point. Just showing your own investment, I mean, the opposite side of that is I feel that there are some people who overdo it. They're very
Absolutely.
amateurish in maybe the content or something, but they have like the coolest mic and they've got the lights in the studio,
Mhm.
all this
Yes.
stuff, and then you hear them
Yes.
like doing their podcast, and you're like, oh my God, you just wasted a lot of money, or like you had a lot of extra to spend. But yeah, I think that if it's concomitant with, hey, we're serious about this, we're invested in this as the podcast creators, that makes sense. um I wanted to ask you about, let's see, so on our show, for Edge of NFT, we're doing like sponsored episodes.
Mhm.
And it does, I don't know if you deal in that or are you just doing the ad insertion, but like we're doing situations where, we've put together packages for people, and one of them is to like play ads in our show, and people ignore it and they say, "Oh, I can have like a featured show where you talk to me and you do the full interview." Like, I want that, even though it's pricier. So I'm just curious if you're, what you have to say on that topic of like actually featuring a sponsor for an entire episode and how those type of relationships might play out.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a really good way of going, especially if you're looking at trying to increase revenue. I have found it is much harder for like a representation firm, or someone else to do that for you. I think that you will succeed best if you're out there pitching that yourself. We do sell sponsored episodes, and we have, and we're trying to do more and more of that because there is a lot of revenue to be had. I think that it's a really good way of going about it. The other thing I think is really valuable is to look at, can you get a sponsor for the show and also sell ads in it, right? So, is there an opportunity for you to do both? And that can really maximize your revenue. And maybe that means that the show is just brought to you by a sponsor, and maybe there's, all kinds of different bells and whistles that go along with that. Maybe they get social media posts and inclusion in your newsletters. Maybe you even put them on your artwork or something like that. So you can definitely look at different sponsorship opportunities, and that might mean that it includes an interview, and maybe it doesn't. It just depends. You could structure it and have, either or. And I would say that in an interview or in an episode where the sponsor is being interviewed, you should make sure that they know. And actually, we usually create two price tiers. If the episode is going to be advertiser free, then we charge a higher price than if they're okay with us putting ads in the episode. But I think it's a really good way, especially with content like yours, to get additional revenue in, because there are a lot of people who want to talk about this topic. Maybe they're not entirely sure how to talk about it. And so, depending on the type of content you have, it can be a really good way to generate revenue.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for that. The other topic that made me think of, you were talking about host read ads earlier as well. Um, I'm sure we can find tips out there on the internet and stuff like that. But any tips like that you think are really stealth or just good, or for us to know about, like once you start reading ads for folks? I mean, I know again on our podcast we're actually writing the ads as
Mhm.
well as reading them. I don't know if that's common, or typically you ask them to write it. So then it also, you have to become a copywriter too, and you have to think about, what do I want to say about them and how do I want to say it. So yeah, any thoughts about like actually putting that copy together?
Yeah, for sure. Actually, that's a great question. I feel like I probably don't answer that one nearly enough. And you are right. So if you're looking at this host read endorsement ad, it shouldn't be scripted. If somebody is giving you a script, then it isn't going to sound authentic and organic. My recommendation is always to think about it from the perspective of the listener. So none of us, even myself, who make money in advertising, say like, I wish that I had more ads in this podcast, right? Like, if only this podcast could have 6 ads instead of 2, that would be great. So what we have to do is think about it from the perspective of our audience. Now, that being said, I do find what happens sometimes that is just as bad, in my opinion, is when a host does something where they're like, well, I have to have ads in here and I really don't want it. And I know like my audience probably hates that I have these ads. And like sometimes I definitely have had hosts that like almost apologize. Like, I'm so sorry, you guys, I have to read these ads. I've even heard Joe Rogan do it, which always makes my skin crawl because I'm like,
Oh,
they're paying
really?
you like $50,000 to read this ad. Like, just be quiet. But yeah, so I think number one, don't apologize to your audience, because research shows that most podcast listeners don't mind ads. So, the vast majority, like 68%, say that they don't mind ads in podcasts. So remember that. And then number two, as long as you're bringing them something that you actually feel is going to edify their lives, it really is helpful for them. Like, we all want to buy products and services that we feel are going to make our lives better. And how many of us would rather have somebody come and recommend, a product? So for instance, I'm starting another business, and my co-founder and I were talking the other day, and I was like, well, I got to open a bank account. I guess I'll call Bank of America. And he was like, no, don't call Bank of America. He's like, there's this company called Brex that like specializes in online banking. They're amazing. Like, go check them out. So went on this morning, started that bank account with them in like, I don't know, 15 minutes maybe. If I had gone through Bank of America, I know it would have taken much longer. So it was great, right? And that's what we're looking for in our ads, right? Is we want essentially a friend to come and tell us what is going to help us in, our lives and our journeys, depending on what it is. So if you can approach the ad read like a recommendation, that is going to do a world of difference to the results that the advertiser gets. The other thing is, I highly recommend that you don't say, we're going to our commercial break, or, here's a word from our sponsors. Your listeners know that when you're talking about products, that these are ads, especially when you say, go to, brex.com/NFT and enter promo code NFT at checkout for 20%, right? I mean, they know that these are ads, so you don't need to tell them that. Excuse me, but you do need
This
to get them.
episode of Business Podcast Mastermind is brought to you by Brex, by the way.
That's right. So go check them out. But if you, so I recommend
It
you
is
don't do
not.
that. It
Sorry.
is not.
I just
No.
realized I have to say that it isn't, just to make it clear. Okay.
Right. It isn't. They didn't give us any money, although they should. Okay, so don't tell people you're going to commercial break, because that is literally just like saying, please fast forward through the next 2 minutes of what I'm going to say, because it's not important to you. So if you can, try to make your ads sound as much like content as you can. And that's the reason that I named True Native Media, because native media is essentially ads that sound like content. Now, of course, we're not trying to, be deceitful at all. That's not the intention. But if we know that this audience is responding to this type of content, if we're listening to content and then all of a sudden we feel interrupted by something, it's jarring, right? When we look at all of traditional media is interruption advertising. So how do we create ads that are not interruptions? How do we bring something to our audience that we think is going to make their lives better, and then write ads in a way that is in line with the other content that we create. So most of the time, starting with some kind of a story is going to be the most interesting, because that's what's going to get people to listen. So if you can start your ad with a quick story, about your life, and, business banking ranks right up there with going to the dentist in my book, right? Like, it's just not super fun. And so as you're starting your ad, if you can, tell a story about, hey, look, this has been my experience, blah, 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 blah. And I found this really cool solution. Let me share it with you. That's going to get so much more attention than, here's a sponsor, here's why they're great, now go buy something from them.
Hey, Ethan, if I could interject for a moment.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
I think you were going to address this, Heather, but doesn't the FCC have some guidelines around having to specifically be clear that it is a sponsor or an affiliate? Is that not the case?
Absolutely. I mean, the FCC does want you to say that they are a sponsor. And so I have not found that the FCC has gotten super involved. Actually, I haven't seen their presence really at all in the podcast space. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't follow the guidelines, because obviously we should. And in that case, like, if you feel very strongly that you need to mention that, you can say something, but I would say it at the end of the ad and not the beginning. So at the end, you could say something like, and I always I like two things. Number one, I think that you should, if you are really serious about advertisers, you should tell your listeners that advertising is paying for the show, right? So, hey guys, I just want you to know that we're so thankful to have sponsors and advertisers for our show. They help make this possible. So whether you put that in an intro or an outro or wherever you put that, I think you should ask your listeners to solicit your advertisers. And then number two, you can say, like, thanks so much for Brex for supporting this program. We really appreciate their support, and they're really helping make that possible. So, please go check them out and you can get this special discount. So even saying it in a way like that, like they're helping support us, is a nicer way, instead of saying like, this is an ad, or, something that's just a little bit harsher.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, on the point of avoiding interruption advertisement, but
Sure.
how do you get around that if you're doing dynamic insertion? It's an interruption of the flow of the show, isn't it? Because I can't plan for that.
Yes. So there's two considerations with dynamic ad insertion. So the first is that it shouldn't be interruption advertising if you're formatting your show correctly. Now, many people who have had podcasts for years have no choice, right? You've got back catalog episodes that are formatted in a certain way, and you really just need to listen through the shows and say, this is a natural break, I'm going to add it in here. What you can do even in those instances, though, is you can add a music intro or outro to that to make it feel less jarring. So I know we've all had experiences where we've listened to episodes where it interrupts somebody like in the middle of a sentence, or it does really feel jarring. And it's because the podcaster has done a really poor job placing those ad insertion points. So if someone has done a good job with ad insertion points, that means that you really shouldn't feel it to be that jarring. So that's one perspective. The other perspective that I have is, I believe that if you really want dynamic ad insertion to be part of the way that you're monetizing your show, that you should format your show in a way that there are natural transition points throughout the program. So let's say you have your intro, then, which is maybe the pre-recorded intro. Then you've got your live intro where you're actually welcoming people to the program. After that, natural transition point, right? Then potentially you have an interview. Where in the interview can you create natural transition points? Then maybe you have a summary at the end between interview and summary. That's a natural transition point. So how do you weave in transition points? And also, how do you weave in other components that aren't just you talking? One of my very favorite things is that when when there are music interludes within a podcast. So I believe that it's really, Guy Kawasaki has a podcast that I love. Of course, I'm going to totally forget the name of it right now. But he uses the best like musical interludes. So in the conversation, all of a sudden, like at a natural pause point, they insert music. And it's literally like, I don't know, maybe 10 seconds. It's
Right.
super short. But what it does, I think, is it creates space for you to process the content. And then also, when we're talking about dynamic insertion, then you could slide those dynamically inserted ads in without it feeling quite so jarring. Now, I get that this is a lot of work, but that's the way that you could do it in a way that it didn't feel so much like interruption advertising.
Yeah, we've talked this is great tips. Thanks for sharing all of that. We've talked about that, using tones or music. I think what curious is your thought. I think it also regains the listener's attention who may have wandered off a bit.
Oh, I totally agree, because like Guy's podcast, I was listening to his a couple weeks ago. And what's so interesting is because obviously like I'm so tuned into advertising, I heard the like music interlude come and my mind was like, oh, and now the ad, right? So like I was waiting for the ad, but the ad never came. And throughout the entire podcast, I want to say they probably did 3 to 4 of those. And it was really nice for me, the listener, to be able to take a pause and to refocus on what it was that they were saying. So I totally agree. I think it's a really good way to produce your show.
Great question, Henry. Appreciate that. By the way, if there's any way for you to increase your input volume, Henry, it'd be great. I don't know if I'm the only one, but it feels like a little bit
Sorry, I'm on
quieter.
my laptop with the built-in mic, and so I don't have the best of setups. Is that any better
All
if
right.
I get closer?
Is it coming through your headphones? Do you have a speaker on your headphones?
No,
Probably.
I don't think so, but I'll
Yeah,
look
you
at the
do.
settings.
I could tell. It got louder when you went like that. Okay, anyways, it's good enough. We can hear you though. Mark, did you have anything? Just want to make sure there's space if you had any questions.
Thank you. I suppose, and I'm sorry, I'm not on my microphone either. I've had a bit of a laptop malfunction this evening, so apologies for that. One of the things that I've often struggled with is that to get the right ad, the right sponsor for your podcast, and having ads for ads sake, just because if it's got nothing related to your actual podcast, or so I do a business podcast as well, and if I was selling ads for something unbusiness related, I often feel I would be not doing myself justice or the audience justice by trying to sell something which isn't related to my podcast. What's your views on that?
Oh, I love that question. So I personally think that we as an industry need to get away from matchy advertising. So let's say I'm Monday.com. I think your podcast would be a wonderful fit, right? Monday.com would be a great advertiser for you. Maybe Gusto, maybe Hello or FreshBooks, right? There's a myriad of different advertisers that could be a great fit for your show. There is nothing wrong with bringing those types of advertisers to your audience. And as you said, it makes sense, right? You're talking about business, and it's easy for you to say, hey guys, I've talked so much about how I hate my inbox. Let me tell you how, this great program has really helped revolutionize the way I, handle my emails and how great it is. You should definitely go check it out. So that is definitely a perfect fit. And there is nothing wrong with that. So I know I said we should get away from it. And it's not that we should get away from it. I just think that we don't need to limit ourselves to those types of ads, because I feel like what happens on both the part of the advertiser as well as the part of the podcaster is we're looking for these perfect synergies, and they do come along. And I think that we definitely do need to try and create those relationships. But I also really believe that we have to look at who is listening to your show and what their whole life is like, right? So, maybe meal delivery would be great because they're busy, entrepreneurs or business owners, and they have a really hard time with mealtime. Maybe house cleaning would be great because, again, they're busy entrepreneurs and they need to like outsource their home chores just as much as their business delegation. So, also, so to me, I feel like I could sit down, you could look at clothing, you could look at mattresses, because, hey, I can't tell you how many sleepless nights I've had as a business owner. I'm sure you have too. So, I think that it's all about how you are positioning the product, and then really looking at, does this person actually really benefit from this product? Now, maybe a jewelry company comes to you and you're like, hey, I'm a man, I'm not going to buy this product. I know that 75% of my listeners are men that are not going to buy the product. Maybe you could say it makes sense for Mother's Day, Valentine's, holidays. So you might be able to, position it from that perspective. Or you might just say, hey, I'm just not interested in that. Or I'm not interested in talking about DraftKings. Like, we're not interested in covering sports betting. Like, that doesn't make any sense for my show at all. So I do really think you have to look at the product and see how it could benefit your audience. But to me, you could do things, like I said, around sleep, nutrition, household maintenance. You could do things around just general health, and you could do business products. So I think it really just depends on the perspective that you have, because we know that the people who are listening to your show are buying lots and lots of different things, not just business products.
I think that's right. And I think I've struggled with that often, because I kind of feel it's not the perfect match. It's not the right match. But equally, I do take your point on, if you tell the right story in the ad, you're going to relate to people who might then buy. So would you say, so I've tested ads on my podcast, and I don't extensively do it. I've done it a couple of times, but what I was thinking was, someone said something to me a little while ago, and I'd be interested in your view, that they said that they felt that podcasts without ads had less reputation, like strength of reputation, even if you're advertising, I don't know, something not necessarily related, I don't know, beds or something like that. That you actually come over as less professional if you don't have ads on your podcast. I wonder what your thoughts were on that.
I actually really do agree, because I have heard a number of times, and I would say most of the comments that I have gotten have been from folks outside of the podcast space, where they will say things like, oh, I was listening to this podcast and they must be doing really well because QuickBooks was advertising on their show. So in their minds, they're like, wow, this brand thought that this podcast was so great that they wanted to partner with them. And hey, that could have been an affiliate ad, right? I mean, who knows? But I do think that there's a perception that when you have ads, that the business community, the advertising community has said, man, this show is good enough that I want to invest in it. So I do think it gives you credibility. Now, of course, there's a fine line there between having credibility and having an ad or an episode that's just jam-packed full of too many ads. I do personally feel like there's a fine line, and I don't ever want to get to the terrestrial radio place where we're like, man, there was 15 ads in that hour-long podcast. So I think that there is a fine line, but I do think that advertisers, especially like in your case, if you could get some that were really well matched to your content, I think that they would add credibility to what you're doing.
And so would you, if you went in, so to say, I did an affiliate marketing relationship, and I've got dynamic ads to insert, as you say, a good transition point, a good point, whatever that point is in the podcast. Would you equally add them at the start and end, and one in the middle or two in the middle? Like how would you, what do you think the most effective structure of adding ads to your podcast would be?
So mid-roll ads tend to be the most preferred ad placement. I will say that there's always kind of conversation back and forth, whether that mid-roll placement is as good as the pre-roll or vice versa. My My perception is definitely that mid-rolls are, I shouldn't even say perception. The reality is that advertisers ask for mid-rolls far more than they ask for any other placement. So mid-roll ads do tend to work the best. And the concept is that if you have your phone in your hand, you push play, the first thing you hear out the gate is an ad. Again, it does depend on how you're structuring the ads, right? So, but then you're more likely to just say, like, hit fast forward. So I usually tell people to start with mid-roll ad placements, and maybe you start with one, right? Or maybe you start with two in the middle. Be careful with how many you stack up back to back, because if you're going to do 4 ads back to back, being host read, they're usually about 60 seconds, about, maybe even a little longer than that. So, if you figure that you're the 4th ad placement in that block, that 4th advertiser isn't going to get very good results, because at that point, most people are going to be like, oh, here comes another ad, right? So they're going to fast forward. So I would start with 1 or 2 mid-rolls, then I would go to pre-roll. I don't usually ever recommend post-rolls unless it's like a pre-recorded programmatic ad that's been inserted, that where you're just like, hey, they're just going to pay me $10 to run the ad or something, might as well, because nobody's going to listen to it anyways. So you could put it at the end. But I feel like if you're trying to get results, post-roll is not a great spot, because most people aren't going to listen to an ad at the very end of the podcast.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Good questions, Mark. I wanted to ask you, I'm sure you've probably developed a lot of information on this, advertiser relationships, like building those relationships. Like when I look at some of the larger players and they have these, like we had Mixergy's, one of Mixergy's producers on the show. I don't know if you're familiar with the Mixergy podcast, but yeah, so I know like Andrew Warner of that podcast, he'll kind of say, hey, this is our sponsor. And by the way, if you have a problem with their sponsor, like, if you're using their service and you have a problem, you come to me and I'll go tell them, and he kind of like, he goes out of his way to kind of vet a sponsor to make sure that like he really wants to recommend to listeners. And then there's the other side of it of like that sponsor really feeling supported. Like it's not just like, hey, we'll put the ads in, see you later, right? I notice a lot of the larger players, they're going to have a relationship with the sponsors where maybe they talk to them on a regular basis and update them. And here's which episode this ad's going to go in, and like a more curated relationship. So I'm just curious, like, what you can say about how the best are curating those relationships,
That's, yeah. So, I mean, Andrew is very interesting because I would say he's one of the only, and I haven't listened to Mixergy in a while, but last time I listened, he was one of the only podcasters that I was listening to that did a true live read. So he literally is interviewing someone and says, Ethan, I just want to ask you, how is your experience with your engineering staff? Are you getting what you need? Because let me tell you, I've been working with TopTal for a long time. I'm sure you guys have all heard a million TopTal ads on his show. But like he literally does like real live reads. And so a couple things about him. Number one, he's been doing it for a really long time, so he's very good at it. Number two, I don't know how he does it and still feels comfortable, like actually asking his guests about his advertising and weaving it in. But maybe they know before they come in, and maybe he tells them like, hey, just expect ad breaks because I'm going to talk to you about it. So I feel like that's interesting. But number three, when we talk about forming relationships, one of the big differences between what he's doing and what a lot of podcasters are doing is he has a staff of people that take care of his advertising, right? He's got sales people, at least one person, if not multiple people selling ads for him. And so that gives him the ability to create relationships in a different way. One of the things that is important to realize about advertiser relationships is, number one, if you are looking to work directly with companies, you do need to form those relationships, right? But also, I think sometimes it gets overlooked that a lot of bigger companies, most bigger companies work with agencies, and you're not actually talking to the advertiser. So while I think in one instance, it sounds great to try and create a really good working relationship with your advertiser, in a lot of cases, you're not even talking to them anyways. And so I think it depends a lot on how you're going about getting that advertiser relationship. If you are talking to the person at the company, then yes, by all means, you definitely need to create that relationship. If you're dealing with an agency, I wouldn't undersell the value of creating a strong relationship with the agency, because if it goes well with one advertiser, they're going to bring you many others. So, definitely think about that. In terms of the types of relationships that you should be creating, I would say that it's really important just to make sure that you're constantly keeping them in the loop about what you're doing for them. Because I find what happens is that you start a campaign, the ads start running for however long they're scheduled to run, and then they end, and then a little bit of time goes by, and then the podcaster calls and says, hey, did you want to do that again? Like, do you want to run more ads? And the advertiser's like, wait, what just happened? Like, what value did I get out of this? And so you definitely, number one, you always want to talk about expectations at the beginning of the campaign. Why are they running these ads, and what are they hoping to gain from them? Do they just really want to partner with you? Do they have a message that they want to get out? Are they looking for increased awareness about their product? Or are they like, we better get 500 orders or I'm not doing this again? So you really need to get that expectation clear at the beginning of that advertiser relationship. And then as you go through, you need to check in with them on a regular basis and show them how you were providing this, hey, I know that you said you wanted a certain amount of visitors, and, I created a bit.ly around the link that we created, and I can see that 200 people have gone to your site from this. Or, these are some extra social media posts I did for you just because I really love the product and wanted to show you what I did. Here's a link to the ad. Had a listener email me and tell me X, Y, and Z about your product, right? So there's definitely different ways that you can go about trying to get them involved in the process. But I would highly recommend that you walk them, you stay in touch with them throughout the campaign. And then before the campaign is even ending, that's when you start talking to them about renewing, right? I know we're getting to the end of the campaign here. We've really enjoyed your product. I know our audience has too. Let's get you re-signed, for the following month or what have you. So, yeah.
And
Cool.
when you're in those sorts of relationships and you've had them on for a month or two or something, and you've been working with them, do the advertisers want leads? Do they want guaranteed sales? Like, I assume the metrics is based on negotiations between you and the advertiser, but just sort of as the general rule, as what the theme is, are they looking for leads hitting their website, or are they from a link that you've provided, or are they looking for actual sales?
What you have to realize as the podcaster is you can only guarantee one thing, and that's that you're going to give them what you told them you would give them in the contract. So that is a host-read endorsement ad that's going to get X number of downloads. So be sure that you're clear with yourself and with them what you can guarantee, because you can't guarantee conversions, right? Unless you're doing it on an affiliate deal, or unless you say, hey, if you commit to this $2,000 contract, we'll run your ads until you get to X number of conversions, I wouldn't recommend that. But you need to make sure that you know for sure what you're guaranteeing for them. And so that is not conversions, because you can't control that. Most advertisers are looking for some sort of traction, right? So that means, and sometimes, and that's why you have to have the conversation at the beginning. And I would literally say, Mr. Advertiser, at the end of this campaign, what does success look like for you? How are you going to look back in this campaign and say, man, I'm so glad that I did this. It worked so well because of what, right? So then sometimes they'll say, we just really need more traffic on our site. If we know that this is a long sales cycle, if we get X number of people coming to our site, that's going to be good. If we get X number of people filling out our interest form, that's going to be good. And you also have those that are like, we need X number of sales, right? So it depends on what their goals are. And that's why it's so important to ask them. Like I mentioned, so the brand advertisers, the 45% of advertisers that are just brand advertising, that literally just means that they want you to say they recognize their company, right? So we did a campaign with Match.com. It was several years ago now, but I asked them what kind of market penetration they had, and she told me 98%. So that means out of 100 people walking down the street, 98 of them could say they knew what Match.com was. So most brands don't have that kind of penetration or recognition. So what brand advertisers are doing is they're saying, hey, we just want people to say, hey, I know what Nike is, so that when I go to the shoe store to buy shoes, I'm going to think of Nike. Those are great advertisers to have, because you can say, look, I've given you this exposure. If they are looking for specific conversions, that's harder, because if they don't get the conversions, they're not going to be happy with the campaign.
Yeah. Thank you.
Great. Well, we're reaching the end of the hour, but I want to make sure there's a little bit of time if you have it. Do you have a couple more minutes?
I do, yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, I just want to make sure that, you can tell us, where people can find out more about you and what you're doing and work with you, and, any other things you want them to do, like compost or, recycle, I don't know, whatever. Give your side of the equation here. Yeah.
Sure, yeah. Well, if you're interested in learning more about True Native Media and what we do, you can go to our site. If you're a podcaster, we have a form for you to fill out. You can fill it out, and we would love to set up a time to chat with you more and talk about how we could potentially bring advertisers to you. So that's just truenativemedia.com. If you're looking to connect more with me personally or any of the content that I create, I'm on LinkedIn a lot. That's probably my favorite place. So you can just go to LinkedIn and look for Heather Osgood, and I'm there. And as you all can tell, I love talking about podcast advertising. So
Awesome. Doesn't get old. That's good. Yeah, and I have to say, I was looking for info on advertising contracts the other day, and just so happened to be, yours came up in the search. So congrats on having some good SEO-friendly content, and thanks for putting resources like that out there. Appreciate
yeah,
it.
absolutely. We try, and I'm glad that you found that, because that's definitely one of our goals. So thanks for mentioning that.
Yeah, nice work. Nice work. Well, I wish we could talk for hours, but everybody else, we've got stuff to do. So, but thank you so much for coming back. And if there's anything that we can do, to help you in your journey, let us know. Good luck with this next business that you're launching. That sounds exciting. Good luck staying focused appropriately.
That'll be the real trick.
We all talk about our ability to get distracted, but I'm sure it's a great synergistic avenue to pursue. So best of luck, and reach out whenever we can be of service.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. It was great being here, and we'll talk to you all again soon.
Thanks
Okay.
a lot. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye-bye.